Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking an updated look at Nvidia's DLSS technology to see what has changed and improved with the latest DLSS 2.3 iteration. In a change of heart compared to earlier this year, Nvidia are now publicly talking about DLSS 2.0 subversions and mentioned to us in a recent presentation that DLSS 2.3 is specifically designed to address some of the issues DLSS has with image quality and motion. DLSS, of course, has many strengths, and we recommend that Nvidia GPU owners use it more often than not, depending on the game, quality settings, and resolutions being used. However, we've pointed out several times in the past that while DLSS can look amazing and pretty equivalent to native resolution rendering in static scenes with very little movement, it can struggle when there is motion on screen, like when you're moving around or when the environment itself is moving. Cyberpunk 2077 was one example of a game with pretty noticeable ghosting when using DLSS, even at 4K using the quality mode, which tends to be a best case scenario for the technology. Again, this isn't an issue in every game that implements DLSS, and there are still plenty of reasons to use the tech despite issues on occasion, but Nvidia, they are well aware of these drawbacks, and that's what DLSS 2.3 is looking to address. Nvidia told us that this updated version is designed to better utilize the existing motion vectors that games provide the AI-driven DLSS reconstruction algorithm, and through various tweaks it should minimize or resolve noticeable ghosting, trailing, or repeated image artifacts. DLSS 2.3 should provide this improvement without the game developer needing to alter their DLSS implementation substantially. So today we're going to just run through a relatively quick update on DLSS to see how version 2.3 impacts image quality, what the improvements are, and what issues still remain. The majority of the captures in today's video have been made at 4K. The issues with older DLSS versions are apparent even at this resolution, so no need to drop down to lower res just for these tests. Time to run through a handful of games, but before that, a word from today's sponsor.
Today's video is brought to you by the Thermaltake Argent E700 gaming chair. Designed by Studio FA Porsche, the E700 is an ergonomic chair with diverse adjustment options to perfectly support your body. Featuring high-quality materials like genuine leather and aluminium, the E700 combines the best of both worlds, gorgeous aesthetics and peak functionality. And it comes in 6 stunning color options. So for more information, please check the link in the video description.
Cyberpunk 2077 is an interesting case in that the game now officially supports DLSS 2.3. However, it hasn't done so through a game update. Instead, Nvidia told us that DLSS 2.3 is being applied through a driver-side interception with the latest Nvidia drivers. That is to say, the game is currently shipping with DLSS 2.1.39, but when you launch the game using these newer drivers, it will automatically swap the DLSS version out for DLSS 2.3. That's a pretty neat feature. Ghosting when using DLSS in Cyberpunk is pretty obvious, and it's most apparent when driving certain cars, especially at night or in darker areas. Here is DLSS 2.1 using the quality mode in the game, with the overall preset set to medium. You can see a lot of ghosting on the rear taillight element as we drive through this tunnel and flick the back out, as well as ghosting of several other areas. Not what you want to see. DLSS 2.3, however, does significantly reduce the obviousness of this artifact. There is still a slight glow following that tail light in motion, but we're no longer seeing the very obvious double image on screen, and ghosting in other areas has reduced as well. When we pair these DLSS iterations side by side with the native image, DLSS 2.3 is getting closer to the ghosting-free native presentation. However, I don't think it's correct to say that DLSS 2.3 has resolved ghosting problems, at least in this game. While the most noticeable ghosting has been reduced with the new DLSS version, I actually think the ghosting on the exhaust pipe in the shadows is worse with version 2.3 than 2.1, as assessed over multiple samples. Overall, I feel the 2.3 image is better, but it's not exactly a full fix for ghosting like Nvidia suggests in this marketing slide. This may represent the improvement some of the time, but it's also a bit misleading as the slide makes it look like the issue is completely resolved when, in practice, it isn't. Again though, this is largely just criticizing marketing material because when actually playing the game, for the most part DLSS 2.3 is a big improvement in the level of ghosting. Here is another side-by-side comparing DLSS 2.1 and DLSS 2.3, and yeah, there is a small amount of ghosting still visible in the 2.3 image, but when actually gaming it's pretty difficult to notice. On the other hand, the ghosting is more noticeable with the 2.1 image, at least in my opinion. As for other areas to image quality, I didn't notice any improvement to static image quality, which remains excellent when using DLSS, whether it's the quality or performance modes we're talking about. I wasn't expecting DLSS 2.3 to improve this aspect, and it doesn't, but good to at least explore that briefly. The other game that Nvidia highlighted as being improved with DLSS 2.3 is Doom Eternal, but this is basically the opposite experience to Cyberpunk for me. As far as I can tell, Doom basically had no issues with DLSS to begin with. I reverted the game back to DLSS 2.1, which was shipping with the title several months ago, and the experience across a wide range of DLSS modes and resolutions is excellent, with basically no trailing in the sections of the game I experimented with. I might just be testing with the wrong elements in the game or wrong areas, but I couldn't replicate Nvidia's marketing sliders. Even the DLSS 2.1 image looked great, so really there was nothing for DLSS 2.3 to improve. I guess this is why DLSS can be difficult to assess at times, because you fire up one game and it has issues while another game looks excellent. It can make benchmarking with DLSS enabled quite misleading, as in a title like Doom Eternal, it's fair to say DLSS is like native, but that's not true for Cyberpunk. Anyway, let's look at some more games. With DLSS 2.3 said to improve ghosting, I was super curious to see how it would go in one of the worst titles available for DLSS image quality, F1 2021. This game is well known to feature quite bad ghosting. It's a very fast moving title with lots of motion. I mean, it is a racing game after all, and the version of DLSS the game ships with, version 2.2.9, isn't good enough to deal with this. The most obvious effect of this is pretty bad ghosting around the tyre areas. I mean, look at this, the ghosting artifacts spread across those thick boy tyres don't really make them look like tyres anymore. It looks like part of the car is extending into that area. But when we check the native image with TAA, it's clear that the car isn't actually extending into that area, it's just ghosting. And this is one of many artifacts that you can see, which also include the tyres themselves ghosting, the rear spoiler wings ghosting, and even the light on the back ghosting as well, depending on the exact scene and camera you're using when playing. With the version of DLSS that ships with the game right now, you probably wouldn't want to enable DLSS, as these artifacts are almost always visible when racing. But the good news is that DLSS 2.3 is a massive improvement in this area, and Codemasters should update the game to use DLSS 2.3 officially as soon as possible. The artifact where parts of the rear would streak into the tyres is resolved, and the rear light no longer ghosts either in the rear camera view. This is quite a big overhaul that brings the DLSS image much closer to the native image in overall clarity, although in my opinion the native image is still slightly better, and we're comparing 4K native to 4K DLSS quality here. What DLSS 2.3 can't address are some other ghosting artifacts you might have seen in shadows, for example. However, these are also present in the native TAA image, so as far as I'm concerned, it's not really a problem with DLSS. What about other motion artifacts? How does DLSS 2.3 handle those compared to prior versions? For this I fired up Necromunda Hired Gun, which has a great forge scene with lots of particles flying around all over the place. It's actually quite similar to the example Nvidia showed in Doom Eternal, so I was expecting an improvement here. However, after closely analysing the results from the current shipping version of the game, which uses DLSS 2.2.11, and a variety of DLSS 2.3 versions, I didn't see a noticeable improvement to image quality. Both DLSS versions still show some streaking artifacts behind the flying particles, and while it's not too noticeable using the 4K quality mode that we're showing here, it tends to get worse at lower resolutions or quality settings. While not much of an improvement here, Necromunda on the whole doesn't have a ton of other DLSS artifacts, so from a game perspective this is kind of nitpicking, but it's also a useful example of how DLSS 2.3 might impact these streaking artifacts in some titles, and in this case there was no change. Watch Dogs Legion does benefit from DLSS 2.3, even though the issues seen in this game weren't ghosting. Currently the game is shipping with DLSS 2.1.39, but manually upgrading that to DLSS 2.3.4 does reduce the instances of moire patterns and shimmering with fine objects. Previously at 1440p, for example, we have shown this issue with the bridge when using DLSS quality mode. Going back to the same area with DLSS 2.3 shows a massive improvement to shimmering to the point where it's not really that noticeable. Also a problem in Watch Dogs were moire patterns on some fine textures, and Legion has some pretty high quality textures with a lot of fine detail. Here, for example, when using even the DLSS quality mode at 4K, DLSS 2.1 isn't very good at reconstructing these details in motion, and you get a few weird artifacts. These artifacts become more pronounced when using the performance mode to the point where it's very distracting. but switching over to DLSS 2.3 does noticeably reduce these artifacts, and while they're not completely removed, the end result is a lot less distracting while gaming. And finally, we'll just take a quick look at another artifact commonly seen in games, using Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition at 1440p as an example. When looking at these fine overhead wires using native rendering, there is a little bit of aliasing, but generally it's not too bad and not very distracting. However, when using the current version of DLSS in the game today, 2.1.55, there is a clear increase in shimmering in motion, even if DLSS looks quite clean when there is no motion. This is a very common artifact across many games, especially when using lower DLSS quality modes like the performance mode, although in this case the example is using the highest quality mode. Unfortunately, DLSS 2.3 doesn't resolve this issue in Metro Exodus, and the artifacts here look very similar between the versions tested. I didn't expect DLSS 2.3 to fix this, as the primary goal of this update appeared to be addressing ghosting, but it's just confirmation that some motion artifacts are still present, and this is just an example using this game. This sort of artifact is probably the second most common in the games that I've seen after ghosting and is found in many titles. Overall though, DLSS 2.3 is a step forward for the image quality the upscaling technology can provide, and it does seem to noticeably reduce the incidence of ghosting, which was one of the more obvious and ugly artifacts with prior DLSS versions. DLSS 2.3 doesn't solve the issues with ghosting completely, but it does provide quite a big upgrade to the experience in games like F1 2021, where DLSS was basically unusable with prior versions. That's how bad the ghosting and trailing was. DLSS 2.3 also seems to help with some other motion artifacts, like some of the weird handling of fine texture patterns seen in Watch Dogs Legion, although that could also be from a combination of DLSS updates over the last year or so. Either way, this latest version delivers the best image quality yet. What this latest version doesn't do is fix every single motion artifact we've seen, and some games still have some trailing or shimmering depending on the exact setting, game resolution, and so on. Reconstructing and upscaling an image from a lower base resolution is a challenge, and it's rare for the output to be as good as the native image. That's certainly still the case with DLSS 2.3 in motion, which is how the vast majority of games are played. None of this changes our recommendations for using DLSS. It's still the best image upscaling technique we have access to right now, and DLSS 2.3 only improves upon what we already had, making DLSS more usable in more games and situations. Depending on the conditions, I would still recommend Nvidia GPU owners use DLSS to improve performance, even if it comes at a small reduction to image quality compared to native rendering most of the time. And it seems Nvidia are working to close that gap between DLSS and native with each version, which is always nice to see. Given that DLSS 2.3 is the best version of DLSS yet, I'd like to see Nvidia open up their system which can automatically upgrade a game's DLSS version, like what is being used with Cyberpunk 2077 right now. Nvidia says they don't just apply this to every game because they need to respect the developer's wishes as to how their game is made and what features are included. That's nice and all, but some developers are pretty slow to update their games or just extremely lazy. I mean, there are still games today running DLSS 1.0. If Nvidia doesn't want to hurt their feelings by fixing their games for them, I'd at least suggest an override toggle that users can apply in the Nvidia control panel, which would be a better system than what we have now of just replacing the DLL file in the game install directory. For now though, if you are playing a game with DLSS enabled and you see some bad artifacts or ghosting, I'd recommend downloading a copy of the latest DLSS DLL file and swapping it out. You'll likely see an improvement, or worst case, the game will look the same. Anyway, that's it for this brief investigation of DLSS 2.3, sort of updating you all on what the latest that this technology is providing, and I guess this provides a good platform for some future comparisons for things as we get into, updates to things like the Nvidia image scaling solution that I'm planning on looking at very soon. We've got Intel XeSS coming up as well that hopefully we can take an in-depth look at when that's available and so on. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. If you're interested in supporting the channel, we do have Patreon or Floatplay, and links to those are in the description below, and I'll catch you in the next one.